A thin morning mist still crawled between the gravestones when Arthur Menezes stopped in front of his father's tomb. He held in his hands a small old lighter, its darkened metal engraved with the faint initials AM, an object he had carried since he was 14, since the day his father simply handed it to him without saying a single word. The cold felt heavier that day. There was something in the air, a thick kind of silence, as if the entire cemetery were breathing more slowly. Arthur pressed the lighter between his fingers, listening to the mechanical click that always transported him back to his childhood, to the smell of grease in his father's workshop, to the strong coffee that burned his throat, to the short conversations that always ended before turning into affection. He ran his thumb across the worn metal, feeling the marks of time, as if trying to read what had never been spoken. But the moment he lifted his eyes, his heart froze. Someone was kneeling in front of the grave, a woman, simple, dressed in humble clothes, her body curled in on itself like someone carrying more weight than she should. Her shoulders trembled slightly. She was crying, not a quiet cry, but a deep, soul-heavy weeping, the kind that comes from within, as if each tear carried years of silence. Arthur frowned. He had never seen her in his life, and yet she seemed belonging to that place, as if she had been there far longer than he had. The businessman took one step, then another, feeling the cold wind cut across his face. The woman didn't notice his presence. She was completely consumed by grief. At one point, she placed her hand on the gravestone, in a way no one, except family, would dare to touch it. An intimate gesture, respectful, filled with memories that were not hers. Or were they? Arthur's breathing grew heavy. Why would a complete stranger cry over his father's grave with such intensity? What connection existed there? Hidden, silent, impossible to grasp at first glance. And then came the question that sliced through him. What did she know about his father that he, his own son, never knew? Before we begin, comment which state you're watching from. The neighborhood where Arthur Menezes grew up no longer existed on any map, at least not the way he remembered it. It was the late 1980s, a time when the world moved slower, when the afternoons tinham o cheiro do feijão no fogo e o som distante das crianças jogando bola na rua de barro. Back then, life felt simpler, though not necessarily easier. The houses were small, built com esforço e teimosia, and every parede carregava o eco das conversas familiares. Arthur was raised in a modest home, where the kitchen was always warm, and the air carried the scent of old wood and laundry soap. His mother, Donna Helena, kept the routine steady with her gentle voice and firm hands. She knew every vizinho by name, and every vizinho knew the stories of each familia around. It was a time before screens, before notifications, before the world became loud. The only technology in their house was a small radio that chiava mais do que funcionava, tuned into AM stations playing samba antigo or news about things they didn't understand but heard anyway. His father, Antonio, was a quiet man, not rude, not cold, just a man of few words. He worked long hours in the small mechanical workshop at the end of the street. Children admired him, adults respeitavam, mas nenhum deles realmente o conhecia, not even Arthur. What Antonio didn't say often weighed heavier than what he did. Sundays were special. They gathered at the worn wooden table, drinking coffee from enamel cups chipped at the edges. Outside, neighbors chatted through open windows, dogs barked at passing bicycles, and the world felt safe, predictable. It was a simple life, sem luxo, but filled with the kind of memories that stay stitched to the soul. And now, standing years later before his father's grave, those memories return not as comfort, but as questions he never dared ask. Arthur's childhood had always felt like a long corridor with doors he never had the courage to open. Some memories were vivid, sharp as broken glass, while others were like shadows, half-formed, drifting at the edge of his mind. And yet, whenever he thought of those early years, everything returned with the same smell, metal, oil, and the faint sweetness of old coffee, the scent of his father's workshop. He had grown up poor, though at the time he didn't know poverty had a name. To him, life was just life. A pair of worn sandals, a single school uniform washed every evening, and the taste of watered-down soup on nights when money was tight. Children adapt to scarcity faster than adults do. Arthur learned young how to pretend he wasn't hungry, how to smile when the electricity was cut off, how how to make toys out of wood scraps and imagination. His earliest memory of pain wasn't physical. It came on a quiet evening when he was 8 years old. His mother stood by the kitchen sink, her hands immersed in soapy water, staring at nothing. The light bulb above her flickered, casting a trembling glow across her tired face. Arthur didn't know what had happened, but he saw the way her shoulders sagged, the way she bit the inside of her cheek, trying not to let a tear fall. His father had come home late that night, eyes red, hands trembling. They hadn't spoken, not a word. The silence between them was colder than any winter. It was that night Arthur understood that adults carried their own storms, and that some storms never passed. But it wasn't all pain. In the middle of hardship, threads of warmth wove themselves into his childhood. He had a gift, something small but precious, a natural talent for drawing. Give the boy a piece of chalk and a broken brick wall, and he would fill it with shapes, faces, skies, whole worlds that existed only in his imagination. Neighbors would stop just to watch him. Some praised him, others laughed softly, saying the boy would end up sonador demais, too much of a dreamer. His father, however, had a different reaction. Antonio would stand silently behind him, arms crossed, jaw tight. He never praised the drawings, but he never destroyed them either. That, in itself, said something. Still, Arthur always felt there was a distance between them, a gap he didn't know how to cross. His father wasn't cruel, but he wasn't gentle either. He was a man shaped by survival, by early hardships that had carved deep lines into his personality. When he handed Arthur the old lighter, AM, engraved on the metal, the moment was so sudden, so unexpected that the boy didn't even know how to react. His father simply placed the lighter in his hand and walked away. No explanation, no story, no reason. From that day on, Arthur carried the object everywhere, hoping one day he would understand why. School presented another kind of struggle. His uniform was clean but faded, his notebook always half-used from the previous year. Some classmates came from better homes, families that could afford shiny backpacks, proper lunches, shoes without holes. Children can be cruel in ways they don't even understand. They mocked his clothes, his quiet nature, the smell of engine oil that clung to him from visiting the workshop, but none of that hurt as much as the day his teacher called him destinado a ser mais just another one, another poor boy with no future, a life pre-written, a destiny sealed by the street he lived on. He remembered walking home slowly that day, his feet dragging through the dust. His father was at the workshop, bent over a broken motor, face streaked with sweat. Arthur had stood at the doorway watching him, this man who worked until his bones ached, who spoke little, who carried secrets behind his eyes. For a brief moment, Arthur wondered if that was his future too. Grease under the nails, a life of silence, a heart full of unspoken things. And yet, something inside him rejected that idea. A small ember, faint but stubborn, telling him he was meant for more, that his talent, his dreams, his restless mind, all of it meant something. But dreams collide with reality, and the first collision came harshly. One day, when Arthur was around 12, he overheard a conversation he was never meant to hear. Two neighbors at the gate, whispering as if afraid of waking ghosts. Leno Antônio, ele não é o mesmo desde aquele acontecimento. Carrega culpa até hoje. O menino não sabe de nada. The words twisted through his mind. Guilt? Something that happened. Something he didn't know. He waited for his father to come home, watched the way he sat at the table, staring at the wall while stirring his coffee. The silence that night was colder than ever, and a small crack formed in Arthur's heart. A crack made of confusion, fear, and curiosity. A crack that would follow him for the rest of his life. Even now, decades later, standing before the tombstone, hearing the stranger cry, he felt that same wound reopen. His childhood had been shaped by shadows he never understood. And maybe, just maybe, the woman kneeling at his father's grave was one of those shadows, now given form and voice. Something told him this was only the beginning. Adolescence arrived for Arthur, not as a gentle transition, but as a rough awakening, a slow, grinding realization that childhood softness was being scraped away to make space for responsibilities he never asked for. Life in the late 80s had its rhythm, its humble routines, but it also carried invisible demands. Everyone around him expected the same script: study enough to not embarrass the family, work early, help at home, survive. alive quietly. Dreaming was a luxury most didn't afford. At 14, Arthur already understood that the world did not hand opportunities, it hid them, and to reach any of them, he would have to climb without seeing where to place his hands. School had become a battlefield, not because of the classes, he understood things quickly, but because of the way some teachers and even classmates treated boys like him, poor, quiet, sons of men who worked with their hands. Society had an odd habit of whispering limits before offering chances. One afternoon, after being mocked for his old shoes and his garage smell, Arthur returned home feeling smaller than he ever had. His mother tried to comfort him, but there was only so much she could shield him from. The world outside their gate was bigger, sharper, and unforgiving. He began spending more time at his father's workshop, partly to avoid the whispers, partly because something inside him wanted to understand the man who lived half his life in silence. Antonio moved through the workshop like someone who belonged more to machines than to people. He communicated through gestures, through the metallic rhythm of tools striking bolts. When he worked, he seemed focused, alive. When the subject drifted toward anything personal, he retreated behind an invisible wall. Still, Arthur watched. He studied how his father fixed engines, how he tested spark plugs, how he cleaned his hands with a cloth stained by years of labor. There was a strange poetry in that, the resilience, the discipline. Yet Arthur knew he didn't want the same fate. He wanted another path, and the world finally offered him one, a scholarship test for an art program in the city. His drawings, which he hid in a shoebox under the bed, had begun attracting attention from a teacher who genuinely believed in him. She insisted he apply, convinced that his talent might open doors he didn't even know existed. The idea terrified him. Telling his father was worse. He practiced the words for days, imagining all kinds of outcomes, silence, anger, disappointment, but nothing prepared him for the actual moment. It was late afternoon. His father was closing the workshop, wiping grease from his fingers. The sun fell behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. "Pi, I want to take a scholarship exam," Arthur finally said, barely louder than a whisper. Antonio didn't turn around immediately. The pause stretched, thick and heavy. "For what?" he asked, voice low. "For art." Another pause, longer, sharper. His father finally turned, his expression unreadable. "Art doesn't put food on the table." "It's what I'm good at," Arthur replied, his voice trembling even though he tried to sound firm. Antonio stared at him, and for a brief moment Arthur saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear? Pain? Memory? It vanished before he could understand. "Dreams don't pay bills," his father murmured. "Life is harder than you think." It wasn't anger. It wasn't cruelty. It was something worse. Resignation. A man who had learned the world through wounds, passing them on like warnings. But Arthur refused to let the moment end like that. "I want to try," he said. "Just try." His father exhaled deeply and turned away. No blessing, no support, no encouragement, and no prohibition. It was the closest to permission he would ever get. The day of the exam arrived. Arthur traveled by bus, carrying a borrowed folder and a stomach tight with anxiety. He walked into the classroom, surrounded by boys and girls who wore better clothes, carried proper materials, spoke with confidence he had never known. For the first time in his life, he felt the full weight of inequality, not as an idea, but as a bruise. He fought through it anyway. For hours, he drew with everything he had in him, not technique, not training, but memory. He sketched the workshop, the street of his childhood, the chipped enamel cups on his mother's table, the shadowed eyes of his silent father. When he finished, his hands trembled. 2 weeks later, the letter arrived. He didn't pass. The rejection hit him like cold water. His mother hugged him. His father barely reacted. But something changed inside Arthur. A crack, not of despair, but of awakening. He realized the world would not bend for him. He would have to bend it, or break it. And then came the moment that would define his adolescence. The symbolic scene burned into his memory like a brand. He was returning from school, rain pouring in thick, furious drops, when he saw his father standing alone inside the workshop, staring at the old lighter, the one he had given Arthur years before. Except this time, the lighter wasn't in Arthur's pocket. It was in Antonio's hand, as if he had taken it back, as if he needed it. Antonio stood motionless, the small metal object glowing under the dim light. His face was tense, his jaw trembling, and then, shockingly, a single tear traced down his cheek. Arthur Arthur froze outside the door. He had never, not once, seen his father cry. It was then he understood. There were pieces of his father's past he had never touched, shadows hidden behind silence, guilt carved into a man who never spoke of pain. And for the first time, Arthur wondered what memory lived inside that lighter. What story did it carry? That moment marked a fracture, a before and an after, the first break between father and son, a silent distance that would never fully close. And decades later, facing the woman crying at the grave, Arthur felt the same cold truth rise in his chest. He never knew his father, not really, and now he would have to face everything he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Arthur didn't remember the walk from the cemetery gate to his car. His mind was a tangle of fragmented memories, questions with no shape, and the single image that refused to leave him. That woman, crying over his father's grave as if she'd lost the world. He drove through the city without seeing the streets. The morning sun rose behind the buildings, but to him everything felt grey, muted, suspended. Every few seconds his thumb would brush over the metal lighter in his pocket, as if the old object could somehow explain the inexplicable. Back in his office, a glass tower overlooking the city, he dropped into his leather chair and stared at nothing. His assistant knocked twice. "Sir, your meetings, cancel them," he said, voice low. "All of them." She hesitated, then nodded and left. Arthur leaned forward, elbows on the desk, hands covering his face. He felt foolish, unsettled, angry even. Why? Because of a stranger. Because she had cried on his father's grave. Because she had touched the tombstone like someone with rights, with history. He exhaled sharply. No, it wasn't about her. It was about what she represented. His father had always been a fortress, impenetrável, silencioso, cheio de segredos que nunca se deixavam ver. The kind of man who worked late, spoke little, and hid everything behind the smell of motor oil and old tools. Arthur had grown up trying to understand him and failing. Now, that woman had shown up out of nowhere, and simply by existing, she had torn open a door Arthur didn't even know was there. A memory surfaced. He was 12, sitting in the workshop. His father had paused mid-repair, listening to something outside. A voice, a car, a whisper. Arthur never knew, but he remembered clearly the look on his father's face. Fear, sadness, guilt. The only time he had ever seen guilt in those eyes. A cold shiver ran down his spine. What if his father had lived a life he never knew? What if that hidden life had left wounds? Wounds carried by people like that woman. Arthur stood abruptly. He couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't appeared by chance, that her tears had a name, a story, a purpose, and that purpose pointed straight at him. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. He needed answers, and waiting wasn't going to give him any. He was going to find her, even if it meant uncovering truths his father had buried with his last breath. Arthur didn't know where to begin. The cemetery was the only place that made sense, so he drove back there, his heart thudding in a slow, heavy rhythm. The morning haze had lifted, replaced by a bright but cold sun that did little to warm him. The gravel crunched under his shoes as he walked the same path he had hours before, but she wasn't there. Only the wind moved between the tombstones now, carrying fallen leaves in lazy spirals. He looked around, searching for qualquer pista, a flor deixada, lenço esquecido, qualquer sinal de que ela realmente estivera ali. Mas nada. If he didn't know better, he might have thought he imagined her. Then he heard footsteps. An older groundskeeper approached, pushing a small cart with gardening tools. His face was carved by years of sun, wind, and probably more stories than he'd ever tell. Arthur stepped toward him. "Excuse me, earlier this morning, did you see a woman around here? She was kneeling at that grave." He pointed to his father's tombstone. The man squinted, thinking, yes, I saw her leave. Arthur's pulse quickened. "Do you know her?" The worker shook his head. "Nunca vi antes, mas..." He hesitated. "Ela parecia conhecer muito bem quem estava enterrado ali." Arthur swallowed hard. "Did she say anything?" The groundskeeper nodded slowly. "Quando ela passou por mim, Estava chorando muito e repetia nome. A name. The older man looked him straight in the eyes. Helena, he said. Ela chamava por alguém chamado Helena. Arthur froze. Helena, a name he had not heard in decades, because it belonged to the one person his father had forbidden inside their house. A name whispered once in a fight between his parents. A name his mother had never spoken again. A name tied to a shadow in his childhood. Did she say anything else? Arthur asked, voice tightening. The groundskeeper thought for a moment. Sim, ela disse, sinto tanto, Helena. Eu devia ter contado antes. A chill ran down his spine. She knew his mother's name. She knew something she shouldn't know. Where did she go? Arthur asked urgently. The man pointed toward the main road. Foi para lá, a pé, bem devagar. Arthur didn't waste a second. He ran to his car, breath uneven. Every instinct screamed that he was already late, that the woman's grief carried answers that were slipping farther away with every passing minute. Helena, his mother, the woman at the grave. The secrets of a father who had lived behind walls of silence. Everything was connected. He could feel it, and for the first time he feared the truth might hurt far more than the questions. Arthur started the engine. He was going to find her before the past swallowed her story forever. Arthur drove without a destination, only a direction, guided by instinct and the uneasy certainty that the woman wasn't just passing through. People with that kind of grief didn't wander aimlessly. They returned to the places tied to the truth. He found her at the edge of the old neighborhood where he'd grown up. She sat on a weather-worn bench in front of the abandoned textile factory, the same factory where his father once worked overtime, the same factory where Helena, his mother, brought him snacks wrapped in newspaper, the same place that smelled of metal, sweat, and dreams that never came true. The woman's shoulders were hunched forward, hands pressed together as if in prayer. When Arthur approached, she didn't startle. She lifted her head slowly, and her red, swollen eyes met his. For a moment, neither spoke. I knew you would come, she said in a low, shaky voice. Why were you at my father's grave? Arthur asked, unable to keep the tension from cutting through each word. Why were you crying like that? How do you know my mother's name? The woman inhaled sharply, as though the truth weighed heavily on her lungs. My name is Lucia, she said. Eu não queria que fosse assim, mas a vida nunca me deixou ser outra coisa. Arthur didn't sit. He waited. Lucia looked toward the abandoned factory, her voice fading into memory. Eu conheci seu pai antes de qualquer pessoa saber quem ele era. Antes dele se tornar esse homem duro, ele me ajudou num tempo em que ninguém mais ajudaria. Arthur frowned. Helped you? Why? Lucia's chin trembled. Porque eu era uma menina grávida e sozinha. Eu trabalhava aqui na fábrica. Seu pai também. A cold ripple spread through Arthur's chest. He helped you raise your child? She shook her head. No, Arthur. He helped me hide her. Arthur felt the ground tilt beneath him. Hide? Who? Lucia closed her eyes slowly. Helena. The world stopped. Arthur's voice cracked. Helena, my mother. Lucia nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. Helena was my daughter, minha filha verdadeira. Eu a tive muito nova, e naquela época, ser mãe solteira significava perder tudo. Seu pai, ele me ajudou, ele me deu casa, comida, dignidade. Ele cuidou de mim quando ninguém mais cuidaria. Arthur's heartbeat thundered. And then, Lucia gripped the bench, as though bracing herself against the weight of decades. There was an accident, she whispered. Incêndio na minha casa. Eu achei que tinha perdido ela. Achei que Helena tinha morrido. Seu pai estava lá na hora. Ele me tirou de dentro, mas não encontrou Helena. Por anos, vivi como se minha filha tivesse desaparecido no fogo. She looked directly into Arthur's eyes. But she didn't die. Arthur felt his breath catch. Explain. Seu pai encontrou Helena, viva, escondida embaixo da cama. Mas quando ele voltou para me avisar, eu já tinha sido levada para um hospital longe daqui. E ele tomou uma decisão. Her voice cracked. He raised her as his own. He married later. He gave her a life. Ele achou que estava fazendo o certo. Arthur's knees weakened. His mother was not the woman he always thought she was. His father had built their entire life on a secret of fire and mercy. And Lucia was the stranger crying at the grave because she had mourned her daughter twice. Arthur whispered, barely audible, You're saying Helena, my mother, was actually your daughter, Lúcia nodded. Eu chorei no túmulo do homem que salvou a minha filha e que passou a vida carregando a culpa de não ter contado a verdade. Eu só descobri quando encontrei uma carta que ele escreveu, mas nunca enviou. She reached into her bolsa and pulled out an envelope, its edges yellowed and trembling in her hands. Era para mim, she said, mas chegou tarde demais. Arthur took the letter with shaking fingers. She continued. Seu pai pediu perdão e disse que esperava que dia alguém encontrasse a coragem que ele nunca teve. Arthur stared at the envelope. Inside was the truth his father had carried until death, a truth that rewrote every memory he had. And as the wind swept through the empty street, he realized the silence his father kept was not cruelty. It was regret and love twisted into secrecy, a life built on saving someone and losing himself in the process. The final silence was not the grave, it was the truth left behind. The afternoon light softened as Arthur walked alone through the quiet path leading away from the abandoned factory. The world seemed slower now, as if time itself had paused to breathe with him. The letter, his father's trembling handwriting on yellowed paper, pesava em sua mão como se fosse feito de pedra e memória. He stopped beneath an old ipee tree, its branches bending gently with the wind. The air smelled of dry leaves and distant rain, and for the first time in years, Arthur felt the childhood scent he had forgotten, that strange mix of dust, summer heat, and something like hope. He sat on a worn stone, unfolded the letter once more, and let the silence settle. The words were simple, imperfect, full of fear and tenderness, a confession written by a man he thought he fully understood, but never truly did. Arthur inhaled deeply, feeling the wind sweep past his ears like an old voice whispering from another lifetime. He closed his eyes. He saw Helena, his mother, laughing in the kitchen, stirring coffee with too much sugar. He saw his father wiping grease off his hands before calling him for dinner. He saw his own childhood through a new lens, as if someone had lifted a curtain that had always been there. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. There, in the soft shaking of the branches, he realized something. Families are not built only by sangue, but also by quem fica quando tudo desmorona. His father had made mistakes, deep ones, but he had also saved a life, and in doing so created the world Arthur grew up in. He stood slowly, eyes burning, heart heavier and lighter all at once. The wind carried a faint sound, something like paper brushing against stone. Arthur folded the letter carefully and pressed it inside his coat. He looked back toward the direction of the cemetery, imagining the tomb, the woman who had cried for decades, and the man lying beneath the earth with a truth he never found courage to speak. Some secrets survive only in silence. Others finally breathe when someone dares to face them. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting a golden glow across the street, Arthur whispered, not to his father, not to the woman, but to the past itself. Some truths don't break us, they set us free. And with that, he walked forward, carrying the weight of 3 lives, the echo of a fire-long apagado, and a new beginning shaped by the shadows of everything that came before.